Okay, so the Chinese self-strengthening movement, 1860 to 1895, this time period. Notice 1860, it's right around the same time Hong Shishuan Taiping Rebellion, right? So remember, Hong Shishuan is largely put down by Confucian scholars, not the imperial army, not the empire of the Qing dynasty, but by like governors, essentially, local Confucian scholars. And this is how they did it. So they started adopting Western stuff. I love this picture. I think this sums the whole thing up right here. But they started adopting Western military technology to use it to put down the Taiping. However, look how these guys are dressed. They're still dressed in traditional Chinese outfits here. They're not adopting Western culture. They're not adopting Western lifestyles. They're just adopting the weaponry. So the slogan of the self-strengthening movement is Chinese learning at base, Western learning for use. We're going to use the tools of the Western world, of the Industrial Revolution, but we're still going to maintain our Chinese culture. We're still going to maintain Confucianism. We're not going to change our culture. We're just going to adopt your tools. This will fail. And we'll look at Japan will be as a counter to this philosophy, whereas Japan will say we're going to adopt Western learning technology, but we're also going to adopt Western culture and everything as well too. We're going to change not just the use, but for the base as well too. We'll talk about that when we get to Japan. So, anyways, they start to adopt some local things, trying to blend the cultural traditions of Europe with China with European industrial technology, shipyards, railroads, academies, and these are all self-strengthening. These are all inside local Chinese Confucian scholars who are trying to build up the country without necessarily the support of the Chinese imperial government, without the Qing dynasty support. They were taking it upon themselves because a lot of these local Confucian, basically governors who ruled different parts of China, realized that they were falling behind and realized that they were weak, and they didn't want another Taiping rebellion. Meanwhile, right around the turn of the century, right around the turn of the 20th century, China's Empress Dowager, so she was a Dowager Empress, meaning that the emperor died and his wife was basically in charge. She was a Dowager Empress. She was in charge while their son was still a boy. His name was Pu Yi, and he was still a boy at this time. He was not old enough to rule, so his mom, Xi Ji, was in charge of China, essentially, at this time period. She openly resisted the self-strengthening movement and viewed it as a failure, did not want any European-style stuff, and mocked oftentimes, like openly mocked and made fun of the local Confucian scholars who were trying to make these changes. By the way, a lot of Chinese people during this time period, if they could afford to, fled China and came to the United States of America. You'll learn about Chinese immigration in the United States of America if you take APUS. A lot of them faced struggles and racism in the United States of America pretty severely, but I mean, during the Taiping Rebellion, millions of people were being killed, so people had to make a hard decision. One of those famous Confucian scholars possibly was the inspiration of General So Chicken, by the way, too. That's where possibly the name came from in the United States of America. But he once asked Empress Dowager Xi Ji for money to be used to build up a navy in China, to build up a modern industrial navy. And she laughed at him. And at a very fancy dinner party, she laughed and said, "This is his navy. This is his navy here." She built herself a giant marble pleasure ship that she could have parties on, a 2-deck marble ship. Obviously, this is not a floating ship. This is not a naval ship. This is her luxury. Look how my nice palace ship is, entirely made out of marble. It cost a fortune. That could have been used to build naval boats to defend the country of China. And she laughed at this party and said, "This is General whatever his name was. I don't remember his real name. This is his ship. This is his navy." Kind of a jerk. So she's not setting China up, and the self-strengthening movement is not going to be super successful in China. Meanwhile, China is losing its spheres of influence. It's losing its power over Asia. Remember, China used to be the Middle Kingdom, and everybody else had to pay tribute to them. Well, they were losing pretty much everything. Vietnam and pretty much all of Southeast Asia, except for Thailand, is being conquered by France. Burma, which is kind of closer to India, but that falls to Great Britain. Korea, Taiwan, all these other places. Japan, and yeah, we'll talk more about Japan later, but Japan starts conquering more and getting more involved. And will actually start taking over parts of China itself. So China will be divided into what's called spheres of influence. Basically, parts of China where Chinese laws did not apply to these foreigners. And the foreigners were divvying up China like a big pie. And see, you hear Queen Victoria. I'm guessing that's a German Kaiser, possibly. You have maybe a Nicholas there. That's the Russians. You have the French, and you have Japanese people. Meanwhile, China is not even involved, and they're just talking about how they're divvying up the pie that is China. So China starts being cut into different spheres of influence, especially the coastal regions, where different countries will have different realms, different areas of control. Inside of these spheres of influence, Europeans and Japanese people who were in those areas had extraterritoriality. Extraterritoriality, which is a real long word, I get it. Extraterritoriality, it just means like um, if I am English and I am in an English controlled part of China, right? If I'm in an English controlled part of China, the Chinese laws do not apply to me. I only have to follow British laws. If I go into a bar and kill somebody, I won't go to a Chinese prison and I'll face Chinese courts. I will go back to England where, of course, I'll be given a fair trial, right? So anyways, no, obviously not. Extraterritoriality is a way of being above the local laws because they didn't view China as an equal player. Like you're a nothing person. We are the advanced superior nations. So it's incredibly insulting. Meanwhile, they also had total control over trade and tax, and they've usually, just basically fleeced the country of China, taking whatever they wanted and making very unequal treaties with China. And so China's divvied up into these spheres of influence. Obviously, a lot of people in China were very frustrated with this. Their government was failing. They were drug addicted in many places, and it looked like everything was collapsing. And so there's going to be a nationalistic revolution in China right around the turn of the century, right around the start of the 20th century. So the Boxer Rebellion. And by the way, this is what we call it. We call it the Boxer Rebellion. If you learn U.S. history, they're going to call it the Boxer Rebellion because America is going to get involved eventually. But it's not what the Chinese would have called it. In Chinese, the name would have been more closely Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. These are people who fought without weapons, without guns, without cannons, using farming implements or oftentimes their hands. And so they were, fighting with their hands. We're talking about just poor Chinese peasants who didn't even have tools sometimes. They would go fight with their hands. And when Europeans saw this, they called them boxers, people who fight with their hands. So, the Boxer Rebellion. Originally, it was supported by Cixi as a way of getting rid of the foreigners, possibly, and maybe she thought she would regain control. However, they're eventually going to turn against her because her failure and her government was kind of what led to the whole problem in the first place. But these people are nationalists. They say, no, China should be for Chinese people and not these Europeans who are above our laws and are abusing our people and abusing our country. And so it's an incredibly anti-foreign uprising. And not just against England, it's against all of the foreigners who are involved in China now. All of these people get out the foreign devils, right? So 1899, basically all across China, we see a big peasant uprising of people trying to get rid of the foreigners. All right, this is an interesting point. A lot of the boxers were misled to believe that European weapons could not harm them. A lot of these boxers were doing Taoist-based rituals that they believed would make them immune to bullets and cannons and swords and slashes and attacks and stuff. And a lot of people look at that and say, oh, that's silly, that's stupid superstition and stuff. Actually, we see this a lot in a lot of cultures. When people are at a huge disadvantage, all around the world. It could happen anywhere. If you're at a huge technological disadvantage, a lot of times people will turn to their face to try to find strength and power. We'll see this later on in Africa after decolonization, the Maji-Maji. In the United States of America, you may have heard about ghost shirts and ghost dances before, which are where the Native Americans turn to their faith to try to repel the Americans. This happens a lot in history. The Boxer Rebellion is not an exception. It's pretty common. The Boxers did rituals that they thought would make them immune to bullets. And I know you'd think that's laughable and silly, but the reality is they were without hope. Right? And so they had no other hope, and so they were turning to their faith to try to give them strength. Didn't work, obviously. The only reason that it will be successful in the beginning is because they had numbers. And we're talking, huge numbers. China's got a gigantic population still to this day. And so while the Europeans who were coming from, talking about people coming from the other side of the world, Japan's close, but almost everybody else is coming from the other side of the world, these Europeans couldn't have the numbers. And so the Boxers had severe numbers on their side. Eventually, the Boxers actually managed to take over cities like Beijing, and they seem to be having some success. However, how did things turn around? Well, when the Boxers move into Beijing, and they're taking over these areas, and the whole city's on fire. Basically, a bunch of missionaries are put under siege. A group of German missionaries are killed, and there's American missionaries, Christian missionaries from America, inside of Beijing, and they are kind of on lockdown, and it's feared that they're going to be killed. And so Uncle Sam gets involved. The United States of America will send an army, and this is a big moment in history. This is a big moment in history for the United States of America. I know this is, world history and we're talking about China right now, but this is also a huge moment for America because while all these Europeans were struggling to put down the Boxer Rebellion in China, part of the reason is numbers. Obviously, there's way more Chinese peasants than there were Europeans, but the other problem is that these Europeans and the Japanese refused to work together. Right? England and Italy and Russia and France, they're all too proud, and they all had their old ancient rivalries. They didn't want to work together. No British army was going to listen to a French military officer, and so they were disunited. And so not only did China have massive numbers, but they also didn't have the organization to put down the Boxer Rebellion. Well, enter the United States of America. We're a young country. We came pretty much out of nowhere now. Yes, we were originally part of England, but we had broken away and we had gone our own way. And now we were rising up and industrializing ourselves and building up our own military might. So when the Americans show up on the scene, we didn't have the old prejudices and the old biases that kept the other European nations apart. And while they wouldn't listen to each other, they would listen to America. And the American general, who's from Ohio, his name's Adna Chaffee, Adna Chaffee will lead not only the American troops, but also lead the European troops and organize them and give orders to all these people, and will put down the Boxer Rebellion. So the United States of America largely puts down the Boxer Rebellion and, solidifies European power in China. Puts down the nationalistic uprising, and now America also gets an open door trade policy. Originally, if you look at the spheres of influence here, notice that the United States of America is not involved. We came late to the party here, and so we weren't part of this, and we couldn't do trade. These places were exclusive trade zones, so only England could trade, only France could trade, only Japan could trade, and they were exclusive trade zones. The United States of America wanted to get involved, so when we put down the Boxer Rebellion, we actually were conquered. We had Adna Chaffee conquered Beijing briefly. Afterwards, we said, hey, here's the peace treaty. You have to accept the open door policy, which is a new trade treaty with China. So the United States of America put down the rebellion and then said, no more spheres of influence, no more exclusive trade. Now everybody can trade with anybody. And that sounds really nice. It sounds really helpful for the Chinese, right? But the reality is we were doing it so that we could trade and not lose out on the exclusive trade businesses. Meanwhile, China is forced to accept stationing of foreign troops throughout their country, and it's obviously not a good position for China to be in. All right, final bit for China here in this pretty long section here. This is the final end of the dynasty. And by the way, if you're keeping track of things, this is all about 100 years. Qianlong dies right before, right around, let's say, 1800. By 1911, there's no more Chinese dynasties. So this happens pretty quickly. So the Republic of China. Revolution in 1911. What's going to happen is that people in China are frustrated with these spheres of influence. They're frustrated with the country being so weak, and they're frustrated with the Chinese dynasty and the Dowager Empress and Puyi, who aren't really doing anything. And so a revolution is going to take place. It starts at a military base. The military base had been influenced by revolutionaries, essentially. A political group called the Kuomintang. You're going to hear GMT or KMT, by the way, for the Kuomintang. It depends on whether or not you're using Cantonese or Mandarin. But Kuomintang political party is influencing the military, and a military base is where it's going to start, and then it blows up from there, and it spreads out the entire country. And this will be a much more successful revolution. So Dr. Sun Yat-sen was trained in Hawaii. He was trained in the Western world, and he had a lot of American influence, a lot of American political ideas, and he wanted to create a republic in China. All right, so his political group, the Kuomintang, are trying to create a republic, American-style republic in China. He's like, we got to get rid of the Chinese dynasty system, this Confucian dynasty, get rid of Confucianism entirely. Let's bring in Western-style republicanism, just like the United States of America. So we see an uprising happen, and rather than unite the entire country, I mean, if you look at most maps at the time, it will say, China on the map. The reality is China splintered into tons of different groups. There were parts that were still basically trying to hold on to the Confucian system. There were small parts of the country that the Kuomintang will be supporting of, and then the rest of the country was basically just local warlords. sometimes gangs, basically, like mobsters. Other times, Confucian scholars who had lost their political authority but still maintained their militaristic authority. And so after 1911, China completely splinters apart. There's no more Chinese dynasties. There's no more Qing dynasty. Puyi abdicates. I don't remember where he ends up going to, but he leaves the country. There's no more emperor. China totally collapses in 1911. So political anarchy. Um, yes, the Kuomintang said they spoke for China and they spoke for the Chinese Republic. They had no authority over all of China. And that's going to go into World War One and eventually lead to the problems of World War Two. So they still have Europeans throughout their entire country dominating them. They have no unity at all. China totally collapses, and that's the end of the dynastic system. All right, so China recap went from being incredibly wealthy, well, arguably the wealthiest country in the world, and culturally powerful, to being poor and drug addicted, and within 100 years. It's crazy. It's how quickly that turned around. European culture went from not being accepted at all to being forced onto them. And then not accepted at all, seen as stupid and barbaric, but their weapons were accepted, the self-strengthening movement, but eventually they get a lot of these things forced onto them. Christianity, and you could argue Western culture, led to the horrible Taiping Rebellion. It's not Christianity's fault, but it was Hong Shushuan's influence from missionaries that led to it, definitely. I mean, he wouldn't have thought himself to be the younger brother of Jesus any other way. And it was right after the Opium War. Humiliated after they lose a war on drugs against a small island nation on the other side of the world. Remember, Qianlong writes a letter to England saying that they're a barbarian nation and they have a lot to learn. Well, not even 100 years later, they're humiliated by that barbarian nation who is forcing them to buy drugs. China's too large to conquer outright, but Europeans start to control the coastal region and then start to spread their influence throughout the rest of China. And the Chinese, meanwhile, start to hate and resent Western and influence and culture, and that's like the Boxer Rebellion. And people obviously very upset and angry about these Europeans and Americans. Attempts to resist all fail, and the country basically falls into complete and total anarchy after 1911. Political and economic turmoil will eventually lead to communism, which will pop up after after World War II. All right, so big section recap. This is a recap of everything that we just talked about. Ottomans were constantly shrinking and struggling to keep up and modernize. Tanzimat, we talked about all that. They were struggling. They were trying to do things, and it just was like one step forward, two steps back. Nationalism and social issues were pulling the empire apart, and most people would agree that even if it wasn't for World War One, the Ottomans wouldn't have lasted very long. Egypt, yay, new country, basically becomes a new battleground. England's going to try to dominate it because of the Suez Canal. And so, yeah, Egypt, sort of independent, sort of a vassal of England now. China rose really high. Qing Dynasty, super high point, falls really fast and really hard. The Qing Dynasty comes to a crash. It's really like a super roller coaster. Europeans, and increasingly the United States of America, use economic and industrial power to control the world. So historic world power centers like the Ottomans and like the Middle East in general, like Egypt and like China, just can't compete. They didn't adapt. They didn't adjust. They had all the answers. They were rich. They were powerful. They were technologically advanced for most of history. But because they did not adapt, because they did not challenge their traditional beliefs and their traditional ideas, they fall to these new young powers who had new ideas and new beliefs. And I think there's a real lesson to be learned there. If you're number one, you don't have an incentive to try harder. And that's a dangerous position to be in. So when you're at the top, always be looking around to see what's happening, and always be constantly aware of change and being able to adapt, because we've seen in history that not adapting will lead to your downfall.